You know, I haven't managed to make a live guild chat for a really long time now, but it's pretty cool when I go back, check the VOD comments, and see people saying it like it is. You want me to do a video about guild chat? Let's do a video about guild chat.
And then, and like we're all thinking the same thing, which is something that we now throw around quite a bit, which is, you know, you've made it when a bunch of developers go into a room and they're like, man, what should we do for this raid release? Or like the story for this raid release. And someone's like, we should do something that makes wooden potatoes soil himself.
Oh, damn. I want to hear what the impolite version... Well, I can imagine what the impolite version was. This was a great guild chat. Obviously, as I've said before, the Head of the Snake release was kind of a double release. So we've had 2 streams filled with lots of juicy information from the devs. And then they dropped this bomb. That's right, guys. You heard it here. The Bastion of the Penitent was the wooden potatoes wing. Hell yeah. So, obviously, with this quote, it's more a comment that, I guess, when they're looking at what they want to do with the raids, they look at what the community in general is looking for. Ultimately, it's not my opinions, it's that I express opinions people resonate with and everybody seems to enjoy. And so, I think this is really, really cool, especially the idea that they're doing that a lot with the game now. They look at what the community is looking for and then try to build stuff that is suited for that. Anyway, we got lots of comments. I did want to open with that. 2 different streams to sum up, and I thought I'd give you guys all the juicy bits. As ever, since Heart of Thorns came out, and these became a lot more irregular from the devs, I think that not so many people like myself are even remembering these streams are going on and watching them. And so I guess I'll do my little bit to keep us all informed as to what the devs are actually saying, because there was some pretty cool stuff, including things like this.
It's all my fault. They murdered my men, but they spared me and dragged me to this infernal prison to break my resolve. The Eye kept me alive, used my guilt to break me down, forced me to be their puppet, but I never broke. I've been trapped here, tormented by my own demons, paralyzed by the guilt of selling out humanity ever since. You freed my body from its shackles. Now I can finally die.
So, before we get into the raiding one, which is what these little snippets I've already been discussing were from, let's have a little bit of a look at 2 weeks ago, rewinding back to when the Head of the Snake had just come out, and the first guild chat that they did with Andrew Gray, who was the episode 4 team lead, and Kirk Williford, who was one of the designers on episode 4. And these guys were talking about the main living world stuff. They were talking about Lake Doric, they were talking about the plot that took place there, and obviously the new story journal steps. We haven't really seen very much of these guys on the streams before, but Andrew at least mentioned that he'd been on the original War in Kryta back in GW1. The original War in Kryta for me is always something I get nostalgic about, because it was one of those times where I transitioned from being a very casual Guild Wars 2 player that didn't really keep an eye on latest releases until it was something massive like an expansion, into being one of those players that spent tons of time on the forums and did lots of speculation about what might be coming and greedily grabbed up every little bit of content I possibly could. It was around that time, the Guild Wars 1 War in Kryta, that my fanaticism was developing, and so those are always awesome releases to look back at to see how that cultivated that in me, and I guess that he probably had a blast, and anyone else who was on this team that got to revisit those ideas back in GW2. So there really isn't too much to say about this stream that I picked out we didn't already know. There were some references to the fact that this area, again, is not internally called Kryta, but it's called Valley area, and they talked about how, yeah, they wanted a level 80 map for a Krytan region because they didn't really exist before. You don't really count South Sun Cove. I learned some interesting stuff about the map. Honestly, I haven't spent too long in Lake Doric now that it's out and everything's settled. I'm spending more of my time in endgame areas like fractals and raids than this actual area or doing the new leather farm. And so apparently the events on this map, as revealed on this live stream, actually all begin on a beach somewhere and then they fan out. And you guys will recall I spoke quite enthusiastically about some of these recent Living World releases, how, and especially current events, we're getting content that is a bit more dynamic than what we saw back in 2012. I know dynamic is one of these very buzzwordy things, and it's particularly confusing in Guild Wars 2's case because we have dynamic events, but most dynamic events in Guild Wars 2 in 2012 weren't all that dynamic. It was, okay, either it succeeds and chains into the next thing, or it fails and stalls. And very rarely a failed event might branch into something else, but that was about it. Current events and a lot of the more recent stuff has been more involved than that. Look at like the ley line anomalies that charge around the map. It's not predefined where all those different events spawn. It depends on how quickly players CC and clear other events, and so it really does have that more dynamic feel to it. Well, so apparently a focus for Lake Doric was not just on completing events, but it's actually how well you complete event chains. And so if you clear this beach with as many NPC allies alive as possible, they'll all fan out and trigger at the same time lots of other events that will all spiral themselves. And that's definitely an enticing idea. I haven't seen it myself, and maybe we don't appreciate it all that much, but I can't help but imagine what Guild Wars would have been like if in 2012 it was all designed in this way, because then it maybe would have truly lived up to that word dynamic. And if they keep pushing it, then maybe these are ideas we'll see used a lot in the next expansion. You guys will remember that Heart of Thorns also was very on rails with the way that a lot of its dynamic events worked. So yeah, lots of little things. There is a link in the description to this first guild chat if you guys want to check it out. It was the much shorter of the two, and particularly I want to move us on to the second one, which was longer and had a great many juicy things. This was about the Bastion of the Penitent. So who we're looking at here is Bobby Stein, who was responsible for a lot of the writing stuff in the new wing. We're looking at Byron Miller, and we're looking at Crystal Reed. These are all people we've seen on streams before. They're all great personalities to have on the stream, and all obviously care a massive amount about this release. Byron specifically, it's not just because of his comments earlier. The dude, you can tell, is so enthusiastic about some of the stuff he says.
That that coat him, and like they move around and they grab at his face, and they like act as these sort of weird otherworldly but in truth, that is a white mantle. Right, like it is a manifestation, right? It is a manifestation. That was all Chris. Chris just like hey, I did this thing. What do you think? And it was another one of those moments where like a couple seconds go by where you're like, oh, I see what happened here. And it wasn't like the pun. Who cares about the pun? The fact of the matter is that that's a part of the representation of Saul's torment that manifests like physically and really horrifically in the model.
And it's really cool to watch. It's an hour and 40 minutes, so believe me, you are getting the abridged version as much as I am good at doing this brevity thing and actually being abridged. So, what do they say? Well, the third thing I want to jump into is actually something Bobby was talking about with regard to the story. Those who have been following me very closely might recall a stream I did a couple of weeks ago where I was discussing whether the raids should have really awesome story or not, and whether ArenaNet should go to the lengths of either removing that story entirely or presenting people an easy mode so that they can get the story even if they're not a very hardcore player. And on the surface of it, and I think the blunt and most obvious answer to this question at first is, well, yeah, there should be an easy mode. Everyone should be able to experience this stuff. But I presented an alternate point of view, one I very much believe in, and that's that an easy mode would undermine some of the experience. So we did a big rant about this, a big conversation about it, a Reddit thread highlighting my commentary on that day. Got like well over, 800 comments, which for comparison on Reddit was more than the actual release did, I think, and was coming pretty close to the developer AMA, so there was a big buzz about it. Bobby does give us a little bit more insight here into this story. Apparently it was something that they were pushing for quite hard, almost didn't even get approved.
I do want to preface this by saying that this raid almost didn't get approved.
Yeah, we had a hard time.
But what really strikes me is the fact he mentioned if it didn't exist in a raid, if this story with Saul D'Alessio wasn't here in this wing, it never would have came to Guild Wars 2.
We had to lobby pretty hard just to even get like the whole concept and like story approved, and without it being in the raid, it wouldn't have been in the game at all.
So that's a pretty striking thing to identify. To anyone out there, specifically in the position of advocating the removal of story from the raids because you think it should be added elsewhere, like Saul should have been in the living world or whatever. I think what the devs are saying there is that's not the way it works. It's either Saul got an answer because raids exist, or he never gets an answer. Without this opportunity for them to tell what they consider side stories in this endgame, Saul never would have had his answer. And so it's not which choice do you go for, it's this or nothing. And so that is quite interesting. I'm curious on some of your opinions there, guys. And think about the next wing as well, or the next fully enclosed raid that they go for. It does strike me that they're picking at side stories, and some of these side stories are really epic, and some of them are answers we've wanted to maybe more than what the main story is going into right now, but they are side stories. What does that mean for stuff like the Wizard's Tower? Did they ever anticipate the Wizard's Tower being a part of the main story, or is it the perfect place for a side story? Well, I think it probably is the latter, right? I'm really excited about going there, and especially I want to see a Titan final boss. Make it happen, people. Anyway, so that's one thing about the story. Obviously, they had a lot to talk about. They were speaking about how Glenna changed from being a generic vendor NPC to actually this character that doesn't just travel with us through the first raid, but even reappeared in this one too. It feels like Glenna is like this core character that might be running along with us in nearly all of the raid content they do, until maybe sometime down the line where she gets substituted for someone else or even killed off. Apparently lots of the NPCs you see walking around in the aerodrome are designers and testers, player characters that they've just imported into the game, and they had some interesting stories about some of the testers' relationship with Glenna and the fact that Glenna might have a husband. That stuff was pretty interesting. Speaking on the mechanics side, there was a story about this temp effect that appeared on the first boss. So what this is placeholder art to show a mechanic while they're testing it out and seeing how it feels to play with before they actually go to the lengths of making it, you know, something that looks good and natural for the encounter. So this is the arm attack, anybody who's played it. And the comment was that through most of the development of this wing, that was being referred to as the pool noodle attack. They talked a little bit as well, and this was very cool, about people soloing this boss, about people soloing Ken. It was nice to see how in tune the devs seemed with this. So I'd noticed there were a couple of threads about this. First, we had a druid in the community who managed to solo a raid boss. It took him 4 hours. That's pretty profound. That's the first time that's ever happened in the game. Very, very slow stuff. It's specifically because of the way that this Enrage works, and if you're totally on the ball for 4 hours, you can eventually whittle him down. And then later, there was a thief who did it, who had a much trickier time, as far as I understand, but managed to do it in a quarter of the time, and in just an hour. Soloing a boss in an hour. Pretty crazy. And they even talked about an old Mesmer that was trying to solo Veil Guardian, which never actually, as a project, managed to finish. But it's really awesome, right? To see how on the ball they are, that all these little things that are happening among raiders are being seen and even thought about by the devs. Moving on, they mentioned that there was a bit of hidden dialogue in the wing that I never knew about. So this is if you play as a human who is a commoner. You guys will recall already that there's lots of situations in the Head of the Snake where your character will refer to their past events. And so if you're a commoner human, you might remember this is the key farming story, okay? This is a plot in which you actually get thrown in jail for a little while. And, well, that's what your character will comment on when you're in the prison. It's something I hadn't pointed out or seen, but apparently it's there. There was some discussion about the Overseer encounter. This was the puzzle room that is very non-conventional as a boss. It can be kind of cheese. It's probably not tuned as well as it should have been, in my honest opinion, but it is a very unique design, a very interesting place. Well, apparently it included some statues that would slowly open their eyes and you'd have to avoid the beams, in a similar vein to the scene in the Never-Ending Story, which I watched as a kid, and I know what scene we're talking about here. This scene used to terrify me about this movie. I actually watched The Neverending Story again as an adult for the first time like 2 years ago, and it was crazy to see how much of an emotional impact that one scene used to have on me. And the horse scene, come on, and we can have a raid fight where our noble steed gets caught in the, what are they called, the puddles of sadness. Anyway, so the Overseer encounter was eventually revamped to be a very different setup. One that was inspired slightly by chess, in that in chess you can upgrade one of your pawns if it gets to the other side of the board, and well, that's sort of what we see the enemies doing here. It's funny because in game there is no way to refer to chess, but they do refer to polymock. I was originally really hyped at that polymock comment. I was wondering if they were drawing comparisons between the Massar and the Asura and stuff, and maybe now watching the stream I realized it didn't quite go that deep. They talked about the fact as well that in this wing, the rats on the floor run away when you walk near them. I noticed this was actually happening, but I didn't realize it was anything special or new. So I feel bad now, but apparently there's a whole story about how this worked. What is technically happening when you walk over to these rats in this wing is they are being feared, but originally the rats couldn't be feared because they're ambient creatures and thus are immune to it, so they're actually cloned special rats that can be feared, and then the fear would hit them and there'd be these giant skulls everywhere, which would look stupid. So then the fear effect had to be cloned and have that visual removed from it, and now finally we have this lovely little thing of rats fleeing from us as we walk near them. That's awesome, and I sort of wish all the ambient creatures in the game did something like that. Give me an ambient creature that wouldn't run away. Maybe they could do something like Taunt as well and have little bats or beetles and things swarm around you when we go to various areas of the world. That'd be kind of cool. All right, so moving on, talking about Samurog. Samurog, some people thought was a Tolkien reference. I actually don't know what that reference is, but it's got nothing to do with that. That was a complete accident. Samurog, as a name, is just the contraction of the artist's name, Samantha Rogers, Samurog. That's literally it, and it was a coincidence for those of you who were saying that. I noticed a couple of comments on my videos about it. Supposedly at the Samurog fight, there's some epic audio effect of when you die by getting impaled on the spears. It can be really hard to hear because you're in a raid encounter, you're probably in comms with a bunch of people, the music's going, all the other sound effects. But supposedly this is really cool. Maybe they'll reuse it somewhere else and give us that nice gory sound effect somewhere that people can more easily identify it one day. On the lore side of the Samurog encounter, they talked a little bit about how Samurog is meant to look like he's from the same neighborhood or wheelhouse or area as the final boss, Deimos. And that's really interesting. One of the main things that was being posed to us as a community in this was this idea of the final boss and this demon realm and the demon itself, Deimos, that we fight in the Saul encounter. The devs are leaving it open to our interpretation as to whether this is real or not. Is Deimos real? Is that place we go to real? They gave us word that apparently, original design for the encounter, we were supposed to be going inside this thing that Saul is chained up to, the Saul's burden that you can get as a back piece. That was where the demon realm was supposedly originally. But the question is this all in Saul's head, just like maybe the spirits and phantasms that are moving in on him? Or is it actually something that exists in Tyria or somewhere else in the mist? Which one is cooler? Well, I can tell you which one's cooler straight away. Obviously, if it's real. I mean, come on, there's some like nice arty ephemeral quality to the idea, oh, this whole fight is just happening in his head. But what is way cooler for the franchise, what expands the horizons of this franchise more, what is more mysterious and intriguing and has more potential for future storylines, hands down, the cooler idea is that Deimos is real, the realm that he's from is real, has some connection with the Mercer and the Eye of Janthir, and that one day we'll get more information. That has got to be the better answer. And going back to Samurog here, if Samurog and Deimos are designed to look like they're from the same kind of area, well, Samurog isn't in Saul's mind. Samurog's a real thing that was a prisoner and broke out, kind of became the kingpin and was watching over Saul from his balcony forevermore, right? Samurog is real. And so if Samurog looks like he's from the same place as Deimos and has mysterious origins himself, come on. It's real, people. Get on the bandwagon. And so then finally, the stream closed down with a bit of a Q&A, and there were a couple of interesting questions that got likewise answers. First was somebody asking about the Eye of Janthir. Its purpose, what it was doing, whether it will reappear. The devs, of course, were insanely cagey about this. I would expect the Eye of Janthir to reappear. There's just too much cool stuff about it, and it's this really nice balance of a sinister and mysterious enemy, and they've definitely pushed that more with this wing. We'll see him more, I'm pretty sure. A connection I missed, though, in the developer's response was that the Eye of Janthir is choosing you in the fight, right? You are being chosen in the same way that people were being chosen in GW1. You are the chosen. That went way over my head as well. I'm an idiot, and of course that makes sense, and so that's very cool. Someone asked, always a fun question when a new wing comes out, with their favorite mechanic from a cut boss. So, I believe Crystal talked about, first of all, the Veil Guardian. It's a story we heard on one of the streams already. But VG, the very first raid encounter that was ever made for Guild Wars 2, was completely different in its original implementation. It used to have a color mixing mechanic, where you guys will recall the Veil Guardian has the 3 different colored guardians. Well, you used to have to like mix primary colors together to get secondary colors, which would allow you to penetrate various defenses and stuff. They built it apparently and hated it and considered it terrible and removed it. So a lesson that they all learned when they were first starting to explore some of this more broad, difficult content for PvE in Guild Wars 2, which never really existed before Veil Guardian in the same sense. I mean, we had Tequato and Triple Trouble, but the balance for those was totally different as well. But for the new wing, we did get some other stories. Apparently there was a cut Samurog mechanic. It was only cut for technical reasons, but this is what I was actually expecting of the new wing based on what I saw in the Nightmare Fractal. So just to get everyone on the same page, in the Nightmare Fractal, there's this vomit mechanic where one of you will be chosen and you'll take a pulse of damage when you vomit, and if you hit someone with that vomit, then it's contagious and they'll vomit, and then they can bounce it back to you, and then you can bounce it back to them and you can do tons of damage to each other, so you'll have to look away from one another to not vomit on one another. But it's kind of this idea that there's a game of hot potato that can strike up while you're doing the Nightmare Fractal. Cool mechanic, and I thought we'd see this kind of thing, a contagion effect, become something in Wing 4. Well, this cut Samurog mechanic was kind of that. Samurog would poison you, and you would take ticking damage in an area around you, and it would get stronger and stronger and stronger. And what you'd have to do is special action hotkey to give it to someone else, which would reset the damage stacks, so it would go back to being sustainable, but now they've got it, and then eventually they have to pass it, and then someone else has to pass it, and you'd sort of bounce it around. And so, yeah, they said that for a technical reason, this never became a thing, but also there's a suggestion that it wasn't a technical reason, that it was more just a design philosophy thing, that they didn't want a mechanic like this because Guild Wars 2, it's about not hating other players. And this is kind of like, actually, it's almost like friendly firing one another, if you like. I think it could have worked perfectly fine in raids, though. There's lots of situations where your life is dependent on the actions of other people in raids as it is. Why is a mechanic like that so far different? But hey, maybe it was just technical. A cut mechanic from Demos as well. This is the Gambler. So you guys might remember, if you didn't play with a thief, there's a moment in this wing where you have to open a door. And when you try to open the door, you get the curse of True Sight on you, which allows you to detect stuff and get through the door. Well, this True Sight was originally supposed to come back in the final fight. So during the Gambler phase, which we know of as he splits into 4 different spirits, this is supposed to be relating to his mesmeriness in the first game as well, which again, I hadn't really thought of. But he splits up and you kill the one with the different weapon and then you push on through. Well, originally it was one player in the group would randomly have the curse of True Sight, and that was the only player who could identify who the real Saul was, and then they'd have to tell everyone in comms. But almost by accident they ended up lucking into this other scenario, which we now see in game, and that's the one that they went with. I can kind of see their old one being interesting on paper, but in practice a bit more lame than everyone being able to identify which one has the special weapon and going with that. So another final little comment. This wasn't exactly a cut mechanic, but they talked about CCs, the new type of crowd control we see in the wing. You guys should understand, even if you don't raid yourself, even if you're mildly bored by everything I'm talking about here, you should keep up to date with what's happening in the raids, because the raids are often showing us mechanics that end up elsewhere in the game, like a special action hotkey that was a raiding thing, and then they were like, wow, this is damn cool, and guess what's starting to appear in the main story, in the maps, and everywhere else? Special action hotkeys, and fixation, and stuff like that, right? So raids are, in some senses, often prototyping grounds for things that end up impacting all of Guild Wars 2, and I think that's really good. There's a lot of stuff in raids that should be in core tier and should be everywhere, and the more they splash that out, the better. So in the new wing, we saw a new type of crowd control. So what am I talking about? Well, we originally had knockdowns, blowouts, launches, stuff like this. There's a new one. They call it on this stream launch to point. I've already mentioned it on my channel. This is some of the CCs you see in the Samurug fight and the Demos fight, where you get hit and you are going to be moved to a very specific area, like a ballerina. It's almost like a jump pad attached to an enemy's fist. He punches you with a jump pad and then you launch to a point. And so the fact that this is now, the way they talk about it is, yeah, it's a distinct new kind of CC. Is this something we will see on the new Elite specializations? Think about what they did with Warrior. What was it? Wild Blow, where you could kind of turn an enemy into a projectile. Never became much of a thing, but maybe we'll see in new Elite specializations launch to point capabilities. Maybe we'll start seeing enemies in other releases using launch to point. Or, I don't know, any kind of opportunity for it, but I think that that might be something to keep our eyes open for. And finally, one last question. Somebody asked how far along the raid wings are before they start the development of the next. And the answer was kind of variable, I suppose. Don't forget, they've only done 4 of these so far. And it strikes me that the way they work is they have a raid team at ArenaNet, but that raid team is actually 2 different teams, right? They're like split into 2 subgroups. And so what kind of happened was Wing 2 and Wing 3 were already started before Wing 1 even came out. And then there were some delays on this Wing 4, just as a consequence of other things that happened in the company. Like Crystal left for a month because she was doing a boot camp for a bunch of new devs that they'd hired, and then they got to go back to working on it. But essentially from this comment, I think it's safe to say that whatever Wing 5 is, it's probably been in production for a little while already, and it might not even take so long to come out as Wing 4 did, unless maybe there's more delays and stuff. Should be pretty cool. Anyway, guys, these were awesome streams. Yes, it was very cool to hear that they wanted to make me shit myself. And, well, to tell you the truth, I pretty much did. So thanks for that. Hope you guys enjoy. Check out the links in the description. And I'll see you next time. Paid his debt to the Lucky Horseshoe, he was eventually fingered by one of his victims and tried as a thief. His punishment was exile from the kingdom of Kryta. The local authorities blindfolded him and rode him out 3 full weeks before leaving him to fend for himself. Alone, broken, lost, Saul wandered through a dense forest for several days, surviving on only roots and berries. On the 4th day, delirious with hunger, Saul emerged from the trees to see what he thought was a hallucination. A city of massive towers reaching into the heavens. The architecture was astounding, and the creatures who lived here